Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. My name is Shobhankita. I'm a researcher in technology geopolitics at the Takshashila Institution. And in this conversation, we wanted to talk about the recent announcements between US and India for a bilateral critical minerals framework. And on the same day, which is May 26th, we also had Quad announce a $20 billion initiative for mining, processing, and recycling of critical minerals. This is both a public-private partnership to galvanize efforts for de-risking and decoupling away from China. So we wanted to talk about this flurry of diplomatic activity because both of these critical minerals frameworks join a longer list. So just between the US and India right now, we had the Mineral Security Partnership that has now been rebranded the Forge. We have Pax Silica. We have the Bilateral Trust that was previously ISET. And then we have the Strategic Mineral Recovery Initiative. And apart from that, just in the recent past, we have seen India sign a bunch of MOUs with resource-rich nations like Argentina, like Chile, and a lot of exploration works that Kabul is doing in Africa. So we see there's a lot of activity. And of course, we also have some diplomatic engagements, the most mature of them perhaps with Australia and Japan. And so there is this web of diplomatic activity and partnerships in the critical mineral sector. So I'm joined by Tannmay here, and Tannmay is a fellow researcher in technology geopolitics at the Takshashila Institution, and of course works on the geopolitics of critical minerals and in the same team. So Tannmay, hi and welcome to this episode.
Hi, Shobhankita. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think, thank you so much for setting the context. You've explained it really well. So I think let's dive right into it, right? If we have a flurry of deals and bilateral, multilateral agreements all happening within a very compressed window, rather, I think the obvious question that jumps out at us is that why is multilateralism or working with other countries / international initiatives important when it comes to critical minerals in the first place, right? Because I think we also parallelly hear resource nationalism and a lot of ideas around being self-sufficient and self-dependent when it comes to critical minerals. So I think, how do we play the balancing act, and where is the balance, or rather, what is the line between international partnerships and self-sufficiency when it comes to critical minerals?
Yeah. So resource nationalism is a separate thing. So resource nationalism is essentially local beneficiation, which is that in countries that are dependent primarily in this industry, in the mining and the mineral industry, and they are essentially resource rich and they are producer economies. We are now seeing this increasing shift where they would like to capture more of this value in their exports. So they would want to have more processing, refining, smelting facilities, and value-added manufacturing, in some sense, happen within their borders. So we see this right now in Latin America. We see this in different ways in Africa, and that's essentially what this word resource nationalism captures. But I think to your other point about self-sufficiency and where you draw the line and why these diplomatic engagements are so necessary, I think the question is quite clear, which is that the US is a minor direct consumer of many of these minerals. Less than 5% of global demand for several minerals, such as cobalt, nickel, rare earths, is what the US accounts for. And of course, if you look at electronic devices and components that have these critical minerals, the value will be much larger. But in general, I think much of the problem today is also that manufacturing capacity has been hollowed out in the institutional West, and we have sort of outsourced all of that to China. And with that, we have also outsourced demand. And so there is no single large direct consumer of these minerals. And the same is true of India, right? In the sense that we are import dependent in the sector. We have vast rare earth reserves that are unexplored. Our processing capabilities are underdeveloped. And so we have the scenario where, to sufficiently dent China's monopoly in this sector, none of us has sufficient leverage to do it alone. And hence, especially in this sector, because we've seen rounds of export controls by Beijing and its willingness to use this as an economic coercion and a strategic retaliation tool of sorts, we see how none of this can diversify away from China alone. And hence, I think diplomatic engagements, international partnerships, etc., are important and necessary. And also, when we talk about de-risking from China, right, I think at one end, it helps the rest of us that China is willing to subsidize the costs and flood the international markets with cheap raw materials and raw minerals. At the same time, that has negative consequences, which is that manufacturing capacity and the viability of many of these mining operations or processing facilities globally is under question. But at the same time, I think complete de-risking from China may not be necessary nor completely even possible. And I think that's the tussle that you alluded to.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the idea here, as we have spoken about before, is that there are differences in market initiative in what the market wants out of critical minerals and what might be strategically right? For example, Chinese rare earths, which we know have a history of being cheap because of structural overcapacity, in the sense that China subsidizes its rare earths so that it can build dominance and so that it can capture market share. So when it comes to that, and when we have critical minerals and rare earths in the market that are extremely cheap, there is often a difference between the market demand for these minerals and what the market wanting these kinds of minerals versus what might be strategically prudent for a state to actually wean off China's dependence on these minerals, right? So leading into that, how do you see the balance between this forming, and what are some broad policy levers that we can do to wean away from China's structural overcapacity?
Yeah. So I think in any way where the state intervenes against market incentives, there is bound to be negative externalities. There is bound to be market failures. There is bound to be not a perfect solution. So I think this is industrial policy in its true sense, and it's trying to engineer top down something that otherwise the market would have solved for itself. But I think that's the reality, like you mentioned, when you have market incentives and strategic interests, not necessarily aligning. And hence, I think the primary issue is that even though we have so many of these diplomatic engagements, they're all very nascent as yet. And we have not really seen assured mineral flows. We've not seen technology transfers. We've not seen sufficient capacity building for either processing or downstream manufacturing. And essentially, the meat of this conversation that I wanted to focus on is on tangible outcomes that these diplomatic engagements and fora can bring about. So firstly, like we were discussing, China's dominance in rare earths is rooted in subsidy-linked overcapacity. And what this does is efficient producers elsewhere get uncompetitive and thrown out of business. And so this overcapacity is really a structural feature of China's investment-led export model. And so if you were to establish sufficient alternative mine to magnet supply chains, you can't do this individually. It's difficult because the quantities required are small. You're up against China's massive state-backed subsidies. And so I think the crux of this conversation really is that diplomatic engagements are helpful, primarily because that helps aggregate demand. It brings some kind of a long-term offtake guarantee, and this not a perfect solution, but potential for alternative markets with different prices. And if you can have a trade block of a certain price, even if not the China price, I think if you have sufficient buyers and sellers in this trade block, that's also in some sense subsidized by the state, then you can have offtake guarantees and procurement guarantees that help sustain some of these businesses. So at the margins, some of these price risk mechanisms that are coordinated between trusted allies and partner countries are helpful.
Makes sense. I think then we ought to move on to the second idea in how we can build on these partnerships into tangible outcomes, right? Like you said. And I think the case study for this pillar would then be Project Vault, right? And you have written about this in your HT op-ed, where you detail, and I find this particularly interesting, about Project Vault essentially being a $12 billion fund for stockpiling certain minerals, but it fails or is not able to differentiate between different minerals in terms of how they should be stockpiled and in what quantities they should be stockpiled, right? And I think this is an idea we've spoken about before, that not all critical minerals are critical in the same way. You cannot compare rare earths that are used in tiny quantities, like maybe germanium, to something like copper that is used as a base mineral in almost everything in a wide variety of end use applications, right? And I think this is exactly what Project Water is also suffering from. So a little light here on what you think is the correct way to go forward with this, and where are we right now in terms of this?
Yeah, so Project Vault is a good idea, but I think it has several challenges. Firstly, it's focused on a few US OEMs, and many of these manufacturers might not necessarily even know the specific quantities and names of minerals that their motors and components and batteries depend on. So, firstly, there's that issue. And secondly, because this is a $12 billion fund, 10 billion of which I think funded by the Exim Bank, 2 billion of which is separate from that. But we also see how there is no differentiation between different minerals. So, for major minerals like copper, lithium, this kind of money may not be sufficient. And for minor minerals like rare earths, antimony, vanadium, that are required in smaller quantities, it will completely distort price globally. And so that's really the challenge, that it's not sufficient demand that's coming out of a few US OEMs, and hence increasing and expanding the scope of stockpiling in general, I think can help with overall demand and also the overall available capital pool. So I think, again, goes to show that you can't do this alone. You must be able to have a larger grouping that can sufficiently dent market dynamics. And hence, I think for larger minerals like copper, etc., the solution may be diversified supply. And for smaller minerals where it is stockpiling, it still needs to be done in a way that's coordinated, that doesn't completely distort market prices as you stockpile. And at the same time, you will need to look for quantities and storage mechanisms that actually make sense. So I think the first is to have it under a structure that makes sense across multiple nations and not just a few US OEMs, but also to then figure out the modalities for the storage and the quantities and the specific minerals, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. I think then stockpiling directly leads into the next thing, right? That in some sense, just having the minerals is not nearly enough when the bigger part of the market and the more economical part of the market, where the money is really made, if you don't work to capture that, right? And we're talking about value added manufacturing now. I think China has an exceptional prowess when it comes to this, when it comes to midstream refining, processing, and then the manufacturing stages. I think these three are stages that China has years of R&D on, has extensive dominance in the market in itself, right? So we all know that China is the world's largest exporter of lithium ion batteries or similar critical minerals tech, right? So what do you think is the outlook on value added manufacturing? How are such initiatives meant to shape what happens with value added manufacturing in the future?
Yeah, so processing is really where the chokehold is. So almost 90% of all rare earths today are processed in China. And it's not that these are necessarily being mined out of China, because we've seen how slowly in the 2010s and for the first time in 2018, China has become the net importer of rare earth minerals, and instead focusing on processing and value added manufacturing. And we see even in the 15th five-year plan, for example, this idea that they should consolidate and further downstream manufacturing capability. So I think that's really where the focus is. And this is important, especially for India, because I think the lead times for mining are very, very long. And so it makes sense, especially when the lead times for mining are long and demand is going to be exponential looking decades ahead from where we are right now to actually focus on recycling and processing, which can yield real technology capability while still giving us some leverage. So as much as we must have a multi-pronged approach, and unless we start today, we won't necessarily be able to get to anything a few decades down the line. I think the challenge really is, can we do more processing and more recycling within our borders? And with processing particularly, it's important because India exports, for example, manganese ore in its raw form. But if only we could do more processing to produce ferromanganese or manganese steel in our borders, we would be able to capture a larger value share of the same. And so it's about being able to capture a higher value of the same while developing technology capability and transfers to enable that. And also, I think, to invest in R&D capabilities sufficiently for technology substitution of many of these minerals to eventually happen. Because I think that's the direction in which the market is moving.
Makes sense. And I think the same volume story from the mining stage also applies, right? You need the rest of the world to have enough demand for non Chinese finished products or refined goods that can then ignore Chinese price gouging or cheaper Chinese products. So I think volume is also an equally important part of the equation along with tech transfers.
Yeah, and similarly with recycling as well, because we are looking at exponential demand such that at any given point in the future, demand will always be higher than what it was previously until maybe, say, 2060 or so. So we're looking decades ahead, and we're looking at any point of time, what is available in terms of feedstock that can be recycled is essentially products, and basically a factor of demand from 15 years ago then. And we just don't have sufficient feedstock to begin with. And hence, I think, again, it's a place where diplomatic engagements, importing of feedstock, importing of end-of-life products to then be able to sufficiently account for today's demand from end-of-life products from 15 years ago that went into the production pool 15 years ago. I think that's why it makes sense to do all of this together. And of course, to do this together, we would need to coordinate finance, capital, finance instruments, but also technology transfers, and to do this in ways that make sense. Because particularly with recycling, we don't have collection networks scaled sufficiently in consumer economies for this to be economically viable. And we constantly are in a situation where fresh produce from China can drive businesses elsewhere out of business. And so it's this coming together again that makes sense here. So again, it's a game of volumes. It's a game of doing it together.
Absolutely.
Coordination.
I think, again, on the recycling front, you on feedstock specifically, right? This is one place where India also has some policy tweaks that could be implemented to improve its position in terms of recycling. I think specifically the most relevant here would be allowing or creating a green channel for imports of e-waste from other countries, because while India is the world's third largest e-waste generator, this in itself is not enough to meet India's critical minerals or rare earths needs, obviously. So I think, so presently in India, such e-waste imports are not allowed, but I think opening or creating a special green channel for these imports from some trusted partners with verification or with some processes in place would really help, again, with the volumes problem as we've been discussing, right? And I think then let's segue into the fifth pillar of what we can do to make these deals work, which is looking at other parts of the world, expanding our framework to less appreciated geographies, including Africa, Latin America, Australia, because these are some some mineral-rich countries. For example, Australia has huge deposits of lithium, Brazil has huge deposits of niobium. So, Shobhankita, I would love to hear your views on that, right? How can we expand these frameworks, these agreements, these multilateral treaties that have been coming up to include these parts of the world?
Yeah. So I think, firstly, China today has equity stakes in mines in all of these regions that we're talking about. And hence, and also the perceptions of local populations to China in these geographies is that China is able to commit large sums of capital for long timelines and is able to implement. It's looked upon as a player that gets the job done. And I think this is the challenge that other countries and governments, not ably and nimbly able to navigate political risks in foreign geographies can then have a problem with, right? Which is, firstly, you need to have blended finance mechanisms that allow as a political backstop for private enterprises of Indian firms, of American firms, etc., to then go and have this entrepreneurial risk taking. So I think it's in this that we can have a better mechanism for, say, due diligence, for example. So the MSP in its previous avatar could, for example, do due diligence of projects and label one as strategic and help that mechanism enough for the funding to happen. So I think some ways to do due diligence, blended finance mechanisms, ability to commit long-term capital and navigate these difficult geographies, I think is a start. And I think this would need to be government initiated, at least at the get-go. And ownership of some of these operational existing mines is important because we know for a fact that to start a new mine will take a long period of time. And so having some control over existing mines in these geographies may help, at least at the source, at this point of time. And across the board, I think offtake guarantees are necessary because unless you have procurement policies with a guaranteed price floor between partner countries in some shape or form, it could be a trade bloc, it could be some nebulous coordination network, as it were. I think otherwise, whether for processed goods, for recycled goods, fresh produce coming out of China will make all of this uncompetitive. And so I think it has to start there, first with offtake guarantees. And of course, setting that floor price and deciding that procurement price is going to be difficult because there's always going to be 3 or 4 prices that exist in the market. One inside of China, one which is, like a very obscure outlier price that somebody would have bought a particular mineral at in a particular time period, especially because these prices in general are super volatile and required in such small quantities that people are able to absorb much higher multiples of costs. So between the price in China and between this outlier price, there is a range, and somewhere between that needs to be a price floor. And there's also the problem that commodity prices in general are cyclical. And so stabilizing with a price floor that can be updated across mineral lists is going to be difficult. But at the same time, some version of this industrial policy would be necessary. Otherwise, this de-risking, even to the extent that we want to happen, just enough so that China cannot keep instituting these export control measures as a tool of economic coercion. For that to not happen, I think this is sort of the bitter pill to bite.
Right. And I think on a closing note, I'd like to speak a little on how India falls into this framework, into the new global order when it comes to critical minerals. And I think the pattern here worth mentioning is that both for some projects like Pax Silica and, for example, Pax Silica, India had initially been excluded from the partnership list when it was published by the US. But I think what the viewers should know is that these represent more temporary frictions between India and the US. I think in the case of Pax Silica, it was due to trade deal negotiations. But broadly, I think the picture, as we've established here today, is that India is not a player that can be ignored in terms of the critical minerals race. India will do better with US cooperation, US will do better with Indian cooperation, and India is embedded in all stages of the supply chain, and therefore India is a required partner on this. So I think
yeah. Thanks so much, Tannmay.
Thank you, Shobhankita.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.